All right, thank you very much. First, thank you very much for inviting me up here. I know Simon's been trying to get me up here for a few years now, and the timing finally worked out a little bit. And as I was talking to him a few weeks ago about what to talk about, I recently hit my 30-year anniversary in game audio. It was last June. And so we're talking about doing like a retrospective and what are some of the constant things, because obviously the industry has changed a whole lot in 30 years. Back then, I first got a job at Williams Electronic Games, and they had just stopped using the VAX computer, and we had a brand spanking new compact 286 with a 20 megabyte hard drive and 640 kilobytes of memory, and we were all set with these powerful new workstations that we had to take on the world. So obviously things have changed a lot. That said, a lot of things have really stayed the same, especially if you're looking about working or making a career in the industry. And so that's what I made a list of 21, although if you count, I don't think it's exactly 21. Lessons kind of learned, what are the consistent things I've seen over the years, and what have I learned sort of along the way as I've been able to do this. I am going to throw in one opinion, not just lessons learned, and I'll point that out when it gets there. First, of course, this stuff. Okay, you had a chance to read that now? So when I was younger, when I was first starting to get serious about music, I had a very, very clear idea about what I wanted to do as a career, and it was pretty much that. I wanted to be Chris Squire. That's why I bought a Rickenbacker. That's why I wore flowy, dressy costumes when I played. I almost didn't go to college to play with this band called Zax, which fortunately you've never heard of because they never went anywhere. But I did end up going to school. I actually went to school to be a tuba major because I was pretty sure that I wanted to be a performer on both bass and tuba. We'll talk about that in a little bit. While I was at school, I did happen to take a couple computer courses. In fact, the first computer course I took was freshman year, Fortran using punched cards. Yes, I'm that old. They're called Hollerith cards. And because I was a music major who had taken a computer science class, this bizarre coincidence happened. I think this was my sophomore year. I got contacted by somebody who worked at a local recording studio. And that recording studio had an amazing, it's called Pierce Era Recorders. That's where Cheap Trick used to record, and Adrian Belew recorded there, and so on. And they had this amazing Neve console. Back in, again, I think it was made in 79 or 78, and this was 82 or 81. And it had moving faders on it. This was, there were no DAWs, there was no, the PC hadn't been invented yet. And it had stopped working. And they're like, well, I hear Brian took a computer course, maybe he's, I wanted to be a rock star. I wanted to hang around recording studios. So I knew that I was starting to kind of getting the feel of studios in the music scene in Chicago, where this was at the time. And so they contacted me and they're like, well, I'll give it a go. So I yanked out their faders and I got myself, bought my multimeter, which I had no idea what I was doing. It ran on 8-inch floppy disks, which I recognized because the School of Music computer also had an 8-inch floppy disk in it. I was pouring through the manuals and whatnot, and just kind of on the whim, I was like, well, I wonder if the disk drive needs cleaning. So I went to Radio Shack, bought a disk cleaning kit, squirted the little stuff on the disk cleaner, and put it in, and lo and behold, the fader started moving again, and everything worked. And I was this wunderkind who they then hired me to be their studio tech, where I learned very quickly how to do things like align a 2-inch tape deck. And also, I got to hang out in a studio. And that's, again, I wanted to be a rock and roll star. I wanted to be around recording studios. And so learned a very important lesson there. People hire people to solve their problems. It never occurred to me in that sort of sense as to what it was, but they had a specific problem that they had, and they just wanted somebody to fix it. And that's in game audio, that's what people hire us to do. They have an issue that they have, they need sounds in their games, and we just, we are there to solve those. And the people who are, one of the traits I've found in people who are continually successful in this industry is people hire people to solve their problems. That's why companies like Audio Kinetic exist. These problems are pretty big out there, people solve them, and people hire them. I also learned that sometimes you want to take some risks. I had no clue. I had never really set foot in a recording studio until I was trying to fix this $250,000 Neve console. So sometimes you do have to take some risks to get, sure, I'll take a look at it. What's the worst that could happen except me even making it worse, which I was very, very, very careful not to. So that was very, very helpful. And around that time, I started dating a girl who had handwriting that was the most immaculate thing you've ever seen. And she had just graduated, and she ended up as a part-time music copyist for this gentleman, John Tagenhorst. John Tagenhorst was an orchestrator for John Williams. He was very, very big in the Chicago jingle scene, and kind of ironically, a big competitor of Marty O'Donnell's back in Chicago in the 80s there. First of all, I was kind of drooling because he wrote jingles and scores for short films all the time. And I kind of had modified my I want to be a rock star thing to I want to be a session musician thing. And here he was, my girlfriend's boss was a jingle writer hiring session musicians all over the place. He also knew that I was in computers. And he actually hired me part-time at $6 an hour, and my job was to help him synchronize video to pictures. So I'd go with him to the editing sessions, write down where different cue points happen for different things in films, and then would map those out on score paper, and that way he could write a score that very, very carefully matched the scene. And the reason he was interested in me is because he thought, hey, maybe a computer could do this, because there's a bunch of math you have to do. And so I wrote a computer program for this Osborne 1. It was a 25-pound portable computer, 4 megahertz, 8-bit microprocessor, Z80, with 64 kilobytes of RAM. The floppy drives held 360 kilobytes of data. And just so you know, again, I was not some computer wizard. I had taken my first computer course the previous semester. I'd say my programming skills were along the lines of, Anna Magdalena Bach, very simple minuets that Bach wrote, these minuets to help teach his wife play keyboard. So my lesson learned there was, how lucky is it that your girlfriend got to do this, and I got an in through that. There's some luck in this life thing that I think sometimes we underappreciate, right? The age-old story goes, if Bill Gates had been born 10 years later or 10 years earlier, he would not be Bill Gates at Microsoft. He'd be successful in something else, but not that. The next thing was this tech thing seemed to be a door opener. There's lots of bass players in Chicago. Chicago's a big, big jingle city, lots of recording going on there. So that kind of stuck me in the back of my mind. So yeah, again, I was working for $6 an hour. I had this awesome computer program. I used it in a whole bunch of spots with him over the years. I'd take the train down at minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, going downtown Chicago in the middle of the winter. But it was definitely very worth it. As a little side lesson learned, I soon learned that I'd done this for $6 an hour. It turns out about a year and a half after that, somebody wrote a similar program for the Commodore 64 in LA and was charging $15,000 to rent it for a month. So that's when I was like, there's different ways to make money. And the whole notion of entrepreneurship kind of popped into my brain there. I was cool that I did it first, but I was sad that I wasn't making $15,000 a month on it. I also learned something else at working for John, partly from John and partly from this guy. I had been doing stuff for mostly 30 and 60-second jingles for John for a while, very successfully using my computer program and I was getting very, very fast at being able to enter the data and so on. And we did a 10-minute industrial jingle for it, for this, and there was going to be like 30 live musicians. I got to play tuba on it. I was super thrilled that he was going to use me for tuba on this session. And the film was a McDonald's corporate video. At the very, very end, 10 minutes in, the last scene was Ronald falls out of bed. And John had written this little flute riff to go along with Ronald falling out of bed. And we recorded the piece, and the musicians are packing up, and I'm in the control room, and we're doing the first look at the sync to tape, because it was all done to click track. This was, there was no Pro Tools, there was none of this computer stuff. This is all analog. And so we had it hooked up, SMPTE sync. We played it, and it's looking a little bit funky to me, but I didn't say anything. At the very end, I heard doo-doo-doo-doo, and a full second later, Ronald fell out of bed to absolute silence. I had screwed up somehow, and that was actually the day I learned the difference between drop and non-drop SMPTE, which was a huge, huge problem. There was no digital stretching technologies to do. The next several hours were spent with razor blades and the score, trying to take this already recorded piece of music. We started at the back and at the end, and worked backwards to try to fix, to make use of this thing we paid 25 musicians to record for this music video. It was not a super happy day for me. So I learned a very, very hard lesson that day. Not understanding the technology behind what you're doing in this modern day media landscape, that being 1983, really cost John a lot of time and a lot of money and some reputation. And that can't happen again. And I think that's one of the reasons that I get sometimes so interested in the technology behind this. I really want to make sure that we understand what drives all of this stuff in game audio that we do, because it's not simple and super straightforward all the time. So I learned yet another lesson with John. I learned a lot of stuff from John. I should let him know that more often. As I mentioned, I wanted to be a session player. I knew that's what I wanted to do, because Rockstar was a little bit of a stretch goal, I guess. And John was very, very kind to me. I was in the Musicians Union. He let me play on a turtle wax spot he did. Turtle wax gives a hard shell finish. Turtle wax. Not too much for me to screw up as a bass player. And I mean, because it's a union session, I think I made like $7,000 over the next 3 years on that one little session. But one thing that I wasn't quite ready as a bass player. And we talk about imposter syndrome a lot. That's come up a lot. If you experience imposter syndrome, it doesn't mean you aren't writing well. It means you think success is for other people, not you. And that's true. That said, at GameSoundCon last month, the question of imposter syndrome came up, and Gary Scheinman, I think, gave a much more complete and better answer. And his first reaction was, maybe you're not up to that level yet. Maybe that's why you're feeling you're not up to that level, because it's really hard to get up to that level. And in my case, I really wanted to be a studio musician. I was a 20 or 21-year-old bass player. I thought I was pretty good. I was pretty good. I can sight read really, really well. So that certainly helped. But to be totally frank, I wasn't ready for it yet. And John used me on a couple spots here and there, right? I'm his copyist boyfriend. But that, I kind of blew my big chance. I had an opportunity to totally impress one of the major jingle writers in Chicago, and I really wasn't ready yet. So, don't get cocky. Have some really realistic self-assessment before you go in, especially if you've got a big opportunity or a big chance for something like that. Totally prepare the lots of stuff out of it. Because if you get your chance and you fall a little bit short of the bar, it's really, really difficult to kind of overcome that. Ironically, I still do a lot of bass playing now, and I wish I were as good then as I were now. I might have been a professional bass player. But things worked a little differently. So as I mentioned, I went to school as a tuba major. I went to Northwestern. And while I was there, I stumbled upon this gentleman. His name's Gary Kendall. Very coincidentally, there's that luck thing again. My sophomore year of college, he had managed to finagle a $3 million grant to study 3D hearing at Northwestern University, and built a computer music studio from scratch in order to facilitate that. Gary Kendall, and actually that's one of his grad students, Bill Martin's, a lot of the seminal patents in 3D audio. In fact, I was literally on the Audiokinetic website blog about 2 weeks ago. There's a example description of virtual sound sources reflection modeling that is based on a paper and patent that they wrote back in the 80s. So I was very, very fortunate. And I discovered music technology through him. And that changed my life. Once I got the bug, my desire to be Chris Squire and a studio musician kind of started waning. I still love playing music, but I really fell in love with technology. And my very surprising lesson that I learned from that was your passion might change no matter how positive you are when you're 17 or 21 or 35 of what you want to do. It can totally take another turn, and you will find yourself just as passionate or more so about something else that you maybe even didn't really know existed before. Life's a long time. Life lasts quite a while, so it's totally easy to change course there. I'm going to enter my opinion now. School is worth it. I get it. This comes up an awful lot on Facebook groups and Twitter feeds and blog posts. Should I go to music school or not? There's a lot of stuff you get from school that has nothing to do with the training you get as a musician or a composer or something like that. You meet people, you experience other things. My roommate was a journalism major who became a professional comedian. You learn a lot of things from going to a little bit more traditional university. So I think school is worth it. That's my opinion, and I'm going to stick to it. Speaking of yet another bizarre coincidence, but also something that happened because I was at school, this computer music department, which was fledgling, had attracted some local people who were also into music technology, one of whose name was Chris Granner. Chris Granner was a composer and programmer at this company called Williams Electronic Games that makes pinball machines. I loved pinball machines. I played them growing up my entire life. My mom used to get mad at me for riding my bike to the University of Connecticut and wasting all my money playing pinball in the arcade which was in the basement of the student union there. And so Chris would pop by the studio once in a while, whether there were talks going on or things like that. And through Chris, when I was finishing my master's, he's like, hey, we have a job opening. We need a composer, sound designer who also can program in assembly language. Are you interested in talking to us down there? And I'm thinking like, oh yeah. Again, I've loved playing pinball my entire life. So next thing I knew, I was in an interview, and at the interview, actually, they asked me if I wanted to play an unreleased pinball machine. It was this F-14 Tomcat machine, and I later found out that one of the reasons I was hired was that I was a really good pinball player. So again, it's a bizarre confluence of these things. Preparation and hard work is definitely necessary, right? I got a computer science degree, I got a music degree, that, not easy. But sometimes you get a little bit lucky. Chris Williams happened to have a job opening right at the time I was nearing finishing school, luck thing again. And also, Tex continues to open music doors, which I found very interesting. There's that again. So that's my lesson learned there. I was at Williams for about 2.5 years and worked with some really amazing people there. I was in awe of some of these people. Larry DeMar, Eugene Jarvis, the creator of games like Robotron, Defender, Stargate, George Petro, who did Narc, not to mention the pinball designers like Steve Ritchie, who played games that I worshipped growing up and put tons and tons of money into. In games, I always tell people, if you want a long career in games, find some point in that career where you can be an employee of a game company. Doesn't have to be your whole career, but you will learn things being around all these talented people about how games are made, how they're put together, how the team dynamics are, that there's just absolutely no way, I think, to replicate that as a freelancer. Again, I've been a freelancer for about half my career, or maybe 2/3 of my career, an employee for about 1/3, and there are things that you get things from going to lunch with the team every day that you just don't get otherwise. One of the most famous sound designer examples is in the original Mortal Kombat arcade. You'd be playing, and then this little face pops up and goes, "Toasty!" That's Dan Forden. He's the composer for the game. And that's in there because every day he'd be in the office playing Mortal Kombat next to Ed Boon, the programmer for it. And at one point, he's like, playing against somebody. He's like, "You're Toasty!" And that made it in. If you're a freelancer, Toasty is never going to happen. Not that Toasty is the be-all, end-all of the universe, but it's these kinds of things that you get from being an in-house person. And there's, again, so much to learn about how games are made. So again, I was at Williams for about 2.5 years, and then for some reason as I was writing this presentation, I can't for the life of me remember why I quit, because I loved this job. It was an awesome job. But I decided to leave and become a freelancer. Now, that seems like pretty common now. What's the big deal? Almost every game audio job back then was an in-house job. I bet that maybe even the whole US, there were maybe 6 of us freelancers in the early 90s. It just wasn't something that was normally done. So over the next about 9 years or so, I worked on a bunch of, I still did pinball machines. I did about 40 pinball machines over the next 10 years ago. Got involved with some companies that did some work for Electronic Arts and so on. And the interesting thing was I discovered that everything was tendriling out. So first of all, don't be afraid to take a plunge. For whatever reason, I decided it was to leave Williams. I think what it was is that a group of us had kind of decided to quit and form our own company, but that never ended up happening. But meanwhile, I had already gotten the I'm going to quit and do something else bug. But so don't be afraid to take a plunge. Again, I had a job that I totally loved, working on games I totally loved, with people that were awesome, and I learned a whole lot. Why did I leave? I don't know. And that the industry is a total spider web. I was doing pinball machines. One of the former pinball artists was contracted to do art and be co-designer of a video game that was a pinball simulation. So he called me because I did real pinball machines and his was the video pinball machine simulation. The producer of that game then liked what I did on that game and hired me to work on the Desert Strike with Rob Hubbard, which was amazing to meet and work with Rob Hubbard. And then the programmer on that team goes somewhere else, and it's just a spidery network that gets built fairly quickly. So that's the lesson there, is that the industry is a total spider web. Make your connections, do awesome work, and then the next game that they're on, they'll remember, oh yeah, I remember I worked with Brian on this game, you should give him a buzz. Another lesson I learned as I was working on pinball machines, the big technology at the time was FM synthesis. And I was like, FM's pretty cool, and it had been around for a little while, but I was really interested in whether or not we could move to sampling instrument technology. And there were no really sample instrument chips there at the time, so I actually created one. This is the BSNT 2000. The BS, that's me. And this was used in a bunch of arcade games. And the thing I learned here was very interesting, is that I was an engineer and a composer. I can just design this thing and that's all I need, right? It's like, no, I really needed to put together a team to do it, right? Somebody has to be the interface with the chip manufacturer. Somebody has to have the financial wherewithal to place a purchase order for $300,000 to get inventory for chips and do that. And somebody has to go out and sales and market it. Somebody has to come up with prototype hardware for it to work on. And again, I went in kind of naively thinking all I had to do was kind of come up with this design. And it was only successful because I had this team of people that were able to support me, and not even support me. It was a very collaborative effort to get this thing off the ground. And I also, again, kind of got that into entrepreneurship thing again. It's like, oh, this is sort of a taste of what it's like to have something and need to market it and sell it and design it there. So that's the BSMT 2000. This was when I was a freelancer. And as I mentioned, I was doing a lot of pinball machines. And we got a call kind of out of the blue one day from a woman named Candy Spelling, who is the wife of Aaron Spelling. Aaron Spelling made Fantasy Island and Love Boat and T.J. Hooker and all these massively successful. And she was like, hey, Aaron likes pinball. I'd like you to create a pinball machine based upon his properties so I can give it to him for his birthday. And we were all very, very busy at the time. And it was like, this is, we want to work on a pinball machine. We're going to make like 3 of them. That's not really going to be worth it. But we wanted to kind of be polite about it. So rather than just saying, no, we're not interested, we figured, well, let's charge an absurdly high, quote something absurdly high, so we can kind of get out of it gracefully. So we quoted this absurdly high number, and she was like, okay. And the next thing I knew, I was flying down to, this is Aaron Spelling's 56,000 square foot house, talking with her about what should be in the pinball machine and who's going to be the voice. I got Jimmy Stewart, I got Bill Shatner, I got Tori Spelling, all these people. And sometime later, the Aaron Spelling pinball machine was born. This is a picture from People magazine, and that quote says, this was Aaron's favorite gift from me. This was shortly after he died. She said, I helped design it, which she did. So the lesson I kind of learned from that one is, ask for money. This is a business. This is something I think Chance Thomas does a good job at. Right? We all love music, we all love sound, we all love games, that's all fine and good. If we're not making money at it, then we don't have an opportunity to work on games and music and sound and cool tech. So by all means, ask for money. A lot of times people will lose a gig for quoting too low. So that was my big lesson learned there. Well, that and being a majorly successful television producer buys you an amazingly large house. So after that, rather unexpectedly, I found myself moving to Seattle, which again was really unexpectedly. I was very, very happy and very, very busy. I was doing about, between 5 and 10 games a year, which were kind of the equivalent of the AAA game today, like Madden, Super Nintendo, or even the first PlayStation version of Madden. So I had a very full dance card, and I had just, put in a second-story addition on my house and all this good stuff. And Microsoft called, and I was like, oh, I'll talk to them. I'd never really been to Seattle much except for a conference once. What can it hurt to, go eat some good seafood for a couple days? And the next thing I knew, I was out there. Xbox, by the way, did not exist at this time. And again, back to Williams, I don't quite know why I decided to stop freelancing and join Microsoft, but it seemed like a fun change. And it really made a big difference in my career. About 6 or 7 months after I joined, I was shown a PowerPoint deck at a pub in England by Seamus Blakely and Kevin Backus. And it was kind of the outline of what this direct Xbox they were thinking of pitching to Microsoft that they should build. And from that moment I was hooked, because as a music technology person who likes games, the holy grail of gigs is to design the audio system for a major game console. So had I not taken the plunge and moved my family out to Seattle, again, before Xbox even existed, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to work on Xbox, which again was a whole lot of fun. So the lesson there is, don't be afraid to change gears. You're working on something. I was having a really, really good time working on some great stuff. PlayStation and Saturn had just come out, so we were just starting to have more quote-unquote real music, studio-recorded music in games. But it was time for something different. And it can make a big difference. So those are some things I've particularly learned. There's some people that I've been particularly inspired by along the way as well. And particularly how they approach certain aspects of their career. One is this individual, Chance Thomas. Chance obviously is a very, very well-known, respected composer, both for traditional media as well as games. Most recent, he just released the score to Lord of the Rings Online. He was instrumental back in 1998, 99 in convincing the Grammy, and this was not easy. I was on the committee that he picked to help do this, to help convince NARIS that video game scores were actually worthy of Grammy consideration. It took a couple of years to convince them that video game scores were worthwhile on this. But one thing that always impressed me about him was how he would market and brand himself. And I talked to him about this, and it was actually deliberate. He said, yes, for a period of time, every time he had a picture of himself that was on the internet or that was going to be used in a publicity photo for some sort, he would either be with live musicians, with a conductor, with a choir, or obviously being in front of musicians, like that first picture up there with the headphones. And that's the image that he wanted to create for himself. He kind of later further modified his brand a little bit, writing his book on composing music for games, to be, again, known as sort of that expert in games who composes for live musicians. So the lesson I learned from that is the successful people that I've seen with long, sustained careers are very, very good at cultivating their own brand. They know what they want it to be. Chance had a very clear idea about how he wanted people to think of him. And then he put into place procedures and mechanisms to make sure that that brand was well kept. So successful game audio people cultivate and maintain their brand very, very well. Somebody else who I found very inspirational for how they do this, ironically, wrote a book also. Or maybe not ironically at all. Maybe it's not coincidental at all. Winifred Phillips obviously spends a lot of time blogging. She gives presentations. She tries to make herself known as the expert in these sorts of things. And that can really pay off. Somebody else who has done something very similar is Sally Kellaway. She, of course, did a series of FMOD videos, working with FMOD down there. That's a very public-facing thing to do. She very, very actively dove headfirst, full body into audio for virtual reality. Speaking at conferences, writing articles, talking to people, to the point where she became well-known and well-regarded as one of the experts in virtual audio, or audio for virtual reality, to the point of being named by Variety one of the 10 virtual reality innovators to watch. Not virtual reality audio innovators to watch, overall virtual reality innovators to watch. Again, I think it's a great example of actively putting forth an image and then using that to further your own career. She eventually, she just parted ways with him, but she eventually was hired by ASIC, partly because she was sitting on a panel with somebody in Norway on a panel where 3D audio came up, and they get talking, and it turns out she knows a whole boatload about this stuff. So the lesson there is, be active in your community. There's a lot of stuff you can do, a lot of benefit to yourself you can get by being active in the community and kind of having that special sauce, right? What is it that stands you out a little bit from other people? A similar lesson learned is Anastasia Devana. First of all, she's a stupidly amazing composer. And she did two things that I think were very, very interesting in her career. One was a couple of years ago, she wrote an article. This was when 3D audio was kind of making a comeback again. I'll talk your ears off at the bar later about the history of 3D audio and the 4 false starts in the last 30 years we've had on it. But at the time, there were 2 or 3 different companies out there that had it. There was Gen Audio and Visisonics and Phonon 3D and so on. And she wrote an article comparing all of them. But she didn't just write an article comparing them. She wrote an app. I forgot if it was for iPhone or Android or both. That it was a virtual scene using the Google Cardboard VR toolkit, where you could actually actively switch between these different 3D audio algorithms. And she almost overnight after writing that article became known as one of the other experts in 3D sound and getting 3D sound out. Because you could go, not only could you read her article, you could go to the Google Play Store and download this for Google Cardboard, stick it, and hear her work. Around that same time, GDC, we do these things at GDC called the Demo Derby, where you place your demo content in front of a panel of experts, and it gets critiqued in front of a crowd of 200 of your peers. And we had tried something at GDC that year, which was rather than just have a passive sound design demo or passive music demo, which we'd done in the past, we actually gave a sample project. With the sample project we had was done by Stefan Schutz. It was in FMOD Studio. It was a little submarine scene that was done in Unity with FMOD Studio, and then Stefan had a programmer stick in some FMOD triggers at various points to make things happen, and the idea was the sound designers and composers would replace the FMOD project files, they'd play their demo for people, and get critiqued on it. And after 3 or 4 people went through this, a lot of the commentary was starting to be, it's kind of obvious when it's obvious that when you do this, then the music changes, and when you go, hits a certain depth, this is happening. It's not very fluid. And then Anastasia gave her demo, and it just blew everybody's away. And people were like, how is it that you took the submarine project and made it so much more naturally interactive than what, frankly, everybody else's demo was? And her answer was, well, I didn't like the way the Unity implementation was done, so I reprogrammed it. Like Kobayashi Maru, if there are any Star Trek geek fans here, that was the no-win scenario simulator that James T. Kirk cheated by reprogramming the simulator so he could win. And that's what she essentially did. She reprogrammed the simulator such that she could do the interactive audio that she wanted to do, and in doing so blew everybody else away. And she has a full-time job now for the last year and a half or so down in Florida working for a company doing augmented reality stuff. So one of the lessons learned there is once in a while, nothing quite speaks like running code. between her app that she made and downloaded and her Kobayashi Maru, as I like to call it, she got to be known pretty quickly. Again, it helps in her case that she writes for real orchestra really, really well. So that was that lesson learned. Somebody else I definitely learned a lesson from was this man, Austin Wintory, and his, how am I doing time? Doing pretty good. And his score for Journey. Remember I talked about lesson learned with Aaron Spelling was ask for money as a business lesson. Not too long after the Journey soundtrack was released, it was posted on the internet. The full thing. Just a literal rip. Totally blatant copyright violation, open and shut, takedown, the whole thing. Austin saw that, and instead of getting all huffy and insisting that it be taken down, he wrote a comment. And the comment was something like, "Wow, it's so awesome that you cared enough about my music to post it. Thank you." And almost overnight, Reddit fell in love with Austin Wintory. Because one of the, I think, YouTube comments after that was, which was, I'm pretty sure this is a direct quote, "Thank you for not being a whiny bitch composer." Because typically, of course, what happens is people put their music up, somebody puts the music up on the internet, the composer comes in and swats them down and says, "Shame on you, shame on you, shame on you." Now, Austin may have, was in some way, Austin's a very, very genuine guy. He was genuinely touched that somebody cares about this, and he has gone to meet his fans, ultimately met the person who did this. But also, he's realizing there's a longer game here. You sometimes have a choice. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be successful? And, right, he would absolutely have been within his rights to say, take that music down, or tell YouTube to put a content strike. I don't know if content strikes existed at the time, but put the equivalent of a content strike at the time. But he thought that it was maybe more valuable to him as a composer not to have that. And eventually, the tide turned in his favor, where even the torrent sites, which had the album, when you downloaded the free illegal BitTorrent of the Journey soundtrack, a little thing came up, says, "Hey, if you can afford it, please go buy it. By the way, here it is for free." So I think that's an important thing that sometimes we lose track of. You want to keep the big picture in mind. It's a long play game. There's another lesson I learned from people that I've been inspired by in my career, which is this man. Sometimes people who are around you sometimes are so good at what they do that they make you better at what you do, and they make you simply want to be better. I was having a talk, this is Paul Lipson, who was at Microsoft for a long time. He was at Formosa, he was at Paramind. And I think we were talking about like a last minute overnight transcription of Bohemian Rhapsody he had to do or something like that. And just the passion and detail that the excitement that I got just from talking. I got excited about this thing that he was doing just by how he was talking about doing it. And it really made me want to be do better at what I was doing. I think that's one of the reasons we all like things like GDC or GameSoundCon so much, is we have a chance to really be inspired off of each other and kind of riff off each other. So the humbling lesson learned is, again, being around amazing people is going to raise your own bar. So definitely surround yourself with amazing people, and you can have a lot of fun. Down to a couple more lessons. So random Facebook post from about 3 years ago has George Sanger, the fat man, asking about 3D audio. Now again, I've done 3D audio going back to when I was studying with Kendall and Martins back at Northwestern. So, I was like, hey, I was telling him about HRTF and all this other stuff. And it's like, oh, by the way, I did a GDC talk a couple years ago, and I looked up the link and I gave it to him. I had no idea what he was doing, but I was just having fun, helping out a friend of mine who was interested in 3D audio. So that's George there. I had no idea at the time, but he was doing some research for a company that he was starting to get involved with. It was doing a lot of stuff for 3D audio. And the next thing I knew, I was on my plane flying out east from Seattle, and landing what eventually was a contract that continues to this day, doing cool 3D audio stuff. So lesson there is helping others is going to help your own career. It's hard for me to think of an example of people I know in the industry who haven't helped someone and over a period of time made that an important part of furthering their own careers. Again, I had no idea I just thought George was interested in 3D audio. And so that's been a fun project for me to work on that. So there's one final lesson that more is a lesson observed than a particular thing in general. Your network is really your most important asset you have as a game composer, game sound designer, somebody working in this industry and making a long career out of it. All right, at this point in my life, I have a pretty rich network, right? It includes people like Austin and Paul and Marty O'Donnell and people like that. But there are a few that sort of stand out for me in my network that I'd like to call attention to. One is Todd Zuckerman. Todd Zuckerman is the drummer for Styx. He was on the cover of Modern Drummer not too long ago. This is on Drummer Magazine. He, in the not too distant future, he's going to overtake Neil Peart for Best Prog Rock Drummer. So he's in my network. The creator of Mortal Kombat is a man named Ed Boon. He's in my network. This individual, Mr. Guy Whitmore, is in my network, as is John Schappert. John Schappert was a former Chief Operating Officer of Electronic Arts, bigwig at Zynga as well, founded Tiburon Studios. And the reason, and actually I have a slight digression. I only discovered this when I was putting the slide together. This is Todd's cover. It's important for me to share what I've learned over the 43 years I've been playing the drums. We're talking about the importance of sharing and giving back to community. Well, Todd apparently thinks that's pretty important too. The reason I picked these four out, though, from my network is they all have something very much in common. And they've taught me a lesson that I think is super important, especially if you're teaching or you have students or you have people who are new to the industry. This is one of the most important things I've learned. Your career is a long play game. It is not a short sprint. It's a long play game. John Schappert, the COO of Electronic Arts, I met him when he and I were both right out of school. He was a cubicle programmer at a little company called Visual Concept, which was like 8 people at the time. We were both nobodies together. Todd Zuckerman, the drummer for Styx, he and I played in a wedding band for 10 years together. First of all, I learned a boatload about drumming standing next to him for 10 years playing bass. Ed Boon started 3 months earlier than I did. It was his first job out of school at Williams Electronic Games. He actually became my best man. We became fast friends over the years. And actually, it's kind of funny. I was at E3, I don't know, somewhere in the mid-90s, making small talk with somebody, what do you do? Oh, I'm in game audio. What do you do? I was like, oh, I'm a producer. And he was like, yeah, I created Mortal Kombat. This random person. And I'm thinking, the creator of Mortal Kombat, I was my best man. I didn't tell him that. Well, I got him talking, and he's like, yeah, he's real responsible for a lot of the overall look and feel and the way it plays and feels. And I kind of casually mentioned, I don't remember, what was your name again? I don't remember Ed Boon mentioning you that well. Yeah, he was actually my best man. And he just got this very gray look on his face. It turns out he was a product manager overseeing a port from the arcade version to one of the console versions. So the mini lesson learned is don't bullshit. It's a small industry. People will catch you. So that's Ed. And that's Guy Whitmore. Guy Whitmore and I played in a band together in college. We were both college students together. And actually, this is P.J. Henke. P.J. Henke is a very successful film composer in L.A. He worked for Hans Zimmer for a number of years. He plays keyboards with Culture Club when they play live. So he got to be a rock star. There's another picture of me and Guy from back when we were both college students. Yep, there's Guy Whitmore. Guy's giving a talk later today. So my point being is that your network of people is something you're going to cultivate over a career. And one of the best places to look for people in your network are your peers right now as you're building your own career, as you're working your way through the industry. Because the cubicle program you work with on a little indie game is one of them's going to become a COO of Electronic Arts or create Mortal Kombat or be a drummer for a major... Styx does like 195 shows a year. And they're like in their, well, except for Todd, they're in their 60s. It's amazing. So your network is your most valuable asset. And actually, that's not even, that's the too silly way to put it. Really, your professional friendships are what are going to keep you going and what really make what we all do here kind of worthwhile and everything. So thank you very much for your time. Cool. Questions are at the bar tonight.